8:12 p.m. The 60-floor rooftop is alive with jazz and victory. Below, the city pulses like a sea of electric veins, celebrating a record-breaking revenue milestone. Amidst the champagne-sipping elite, Elias, a 41-year-old single father and operations lead, stands alone with a glass of water. He isn't watching the glamour. He's staring at the dark patches between the lights. Suddenly, the 35-year-old CEO, Clara Vance, smirks and teases, "Enjoying the view, Elias? Or is it just too high for you?" The leaders chuckle, but Elias turns, his calm chilling the air. He delivers a reply that silences the entire rooftop. It wasn't loud. It was the truth of what held their world up. Elias Thorne was a man who lived in the silence of logistics. At 41, his life was a carefully constructed balance of spreadsheets and school runs. He had been a widower for 7 years, a period that had etched a quiet strength into his features and a permanent watchfulness in his eyes. He worked in the operations department for a decade, a ghost in the corporate machine who optimized costs and untangled global supply chain knots without ever asking for a spotlight. To the young high flyers in the marketing and sales departments, Elias was just the man who kept the lights on. They didn't see the hours he spent at his kitchen table long after his 12-year-old daughter, Maya, had gone to sleep, recalculating shipping routes to save a fraction of a percent that translated into millions for the company. He was the architect of invisible bridges, the one who knew that a 3-cent increase in fuel costs across 10,000 trucks meant the difference between a bonus for the executives and a layoff for the drivers. On the night of the record-breaking gala, Elias hadn't wanted to attend. He preferred the warmth of his modest home to the cold prestige of a corporate rooftop. Before he left, Maya had stood on her tiptoes to straighten his collar, her eyes bright with pride. She told him not to leave early this time, wanting him to enjoy the success she knew he had worked so hard to build. "You're the heart of that place, Dad," she had whispered, pinning a small handmade flower to his lapel. In his pocket, Elias carried a small photo she had sent him earlier that day, a painting she had finished in her art class. It was a simple landscape, but to Elias it was more valuable than the entire building he stood upon. He was a man of the earth, of reality, and of deep, unshakable roots. He attended the party because it was required, but his mind was already on the laundry that needed folding and the science project due on Monday. Clara Vance, the CEO, was the polar opposite of Elias's grounded nature. At 35, she was a phenomenon of the business world, brilliant, aggressive, and possessing a wit that could cut through a boardroom like a laser. She believed that success was a product of high-velocity competition and that the view from the top was reserved for those who never looked down. Clara led with a blend of charisma and sarcasm, often using humor to keep her subordinates on their toes. She viewed the company as a soaring aircraft, and herself as the pilot who decided the destination. To her, the company's recent record-breaking revenue was a personal victory, a validation of her move fast and break things philosophy. She moved through the party like a predator in silk, followed by a trail of ambitious young vice presidents who echoed her every laugh, eager to catch whatever stardust fell from her trajectory. As the evening progressed, Clara noticed Elias standing by the glass perimeter. He looked out of place in his off-the-rack suit, holding a glass of water while everyone else toasted with $1,000 bottles. To Clara, he looked like a man intimidated by the height of his own success. She saw an opportunity for a light-hearted jab, a way to loosen up the boring operations guy. She didn't realize that Elias wasn't looking at the city lights as a dream. He was looking at them as a data set. He was observing the gridlock on the bridges and the flickering lights of the distribution centers. He saw the friction that Clara's rapid growth had created, and he was mourning the stability they were about to lose. While Clara saw a skyline of glittering lights, Elias saw a map of mounting pressure points, each one ready to snap under the weight of the company's unbridled greed. The interaction was brief, but monumental. When Clara asked if he was enjoying the view, her tone suggested that he should be grateful just to be invited to the table. The young leaders behind her were ready to laugh, viewing Elias as a relic of an older, slower era of business. But when Elias spoke, his voice didn't shake. He didn't offer a platitude or a thank you. He offered a cold, hard truth that stripped the glamour from the night. He looked at the CEO and the surrounding elite and realized they were celebrating a house of cards. His reply wasn't just a response to a tease. It was a warning from the man who stood in the engine room while the captain was busy admiring the sunset. The silence that followed Elias's comment about counting delivery routes was thick enough to choke the music. The laughter died in the throats of the vice presidents. Elias didn't look away. He kept his eyes on the crawling line of headlights on the highway far below. He explained that if those routes failed, the view they were currently celebrating would vanish in less than 72 hours. He spoke of the last-mile collapse and the midstream bottleneck with a clinical detachment that made the champagne in the executives' glasses feel like lead. He wasn't being dramatic. He was being mathematical. He told them that for every $1 of revenue they had gained in the last quarter, they had added $2 of stress to a logistics system that was never designed for this volume. He pointed to a dark sector near the harbor, a major hub that had gone dark for 20 minutes that evening due to a power surge their overloaded servers couldn't handle. Clara's smirk didn't just fade. It disintegrated. She looked at Elias, really looked at him, for the first time in 3 years. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the terrifying clarity of a man who knows exactly when a bridge is going to break. The young leaders tried to pivot back to the celebration, making a joke about how ops people always see the glass half empty. But Clara didn't join them. She found herself stepping closer to the glass, looking down at the same traffic Elias was watching. For the first time, she didn't see a shimmering city of gold. She saw a complex, fragile network of movement that was straining under the weight of her own ambition. She felt the vibration of the city rising through the soles of her shoes, and for the first time, it felt like a tremor of warning rather than a pulse of power. The emotional peak hit when Elias simply nodded to her, finished his water, and said he had to go because his daughter was waiting up for him. The atmosphere of the party shifted instantly. It was no longer a celebration of a milestone. It was the beginning of an interrogation of reality. Clara spent the rest of the night in a daze, the jazz music sounding dissonant and the laughter of her peers sounding hollow. She realized that she had been steering the ship based on the speed of the wind while ignoring the depth of the water. She went back to her penthouse that night, and, instead of sleeping, she opened the raw operational data files that she usually left for her deputies to summarize. She looked for Elias's name in the metadata of the reports. She found it on every single analysis regarding risk, overcapacity, and infrastructure fatigue. He had been screaming in the footnotes for months, using words like imminent failure and unsustainable load, and she had been too busy looking at the view to read them. The connection between the two of them, though they were miles apart that night, became the central axis of the company's future. Elias was at home, sitting on the edge of Maya's bed, listening to her talk about her art project. He felt a sense of relief in the simplicity of his home life, but a lingering dread for the thousands of families whose paychecks depended on a company that was currently driving toward a cliff at 100 miles an hour. He knew that if the system collapsed, it wouldn't be the executives on the rooftop who suffered first. It would be the warehouse workers and the delivery drivers who lost their livelihoods. Clara, on the other hand, was sitting in her high-tech office, surrounded by glass and chrome, feeling more isolated than she ever had. She realized that the operations guy was the only person in the building who had been honest with her, even if he didn't realize he was doing it. By the early hours of the morning, Clara had made a decision. She wasn't going to fire Elias for ruining the mood. She was going to bring him into the center of the storm. She saw that his humble nature was not a sign of a lack of ambition, but a sign of a profound commitment to the truth. She recalled his words about the delivery routes and realized that his perspective was the only thing that could save the $2 billion deal they had just signed. She realized that a CEO who only enjoys the view is a CEO who is destined to fall from the height. She needed a man who understood the ground. She needed the single dad who counted the trucks while everyone else counted the stars. She needed someone who cared more about the foundation than the penthouse. The emergency meeting was called for 7 a.m. The boardroom was filled with the same people who had been laughing on the rooftop just hours before, but now they looked tired and anxious. Clara sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. She didn't start with a motivational speech. She simply asked Elias to take the floor. Elias walked to the front of the room, carrying a single manila folder. He didn't use a flashy PowerPoint. He used a whiteboard. He drew a diagram of their distribution network and then began to mark the points of failure in red ink. He showed them that their primary fulfillment center was at 94% capacity. He showed them that their delivery partners were beginning to drop orders to prioritize higher-paying contracts. He showed them the hidden cost of success, the thousands of dissatisfied customers who were already planning their exit. The confrontation came from the chief financial officer, Marcus, a man who lived for the quarterly earnings call. He argued that the growth was what the shareholders demanded and that operational friction was just a part of the game. "We're in the business of momentum, Thorne," Marcus snapped, leaning forward. "You're asking us to hit the brakes while we're winning." He accused Elias of being a pessimist who didn't understand the scale of modern commerce. Elias didn't flinch. He handed the CFO a sheet of paper. It was a list of late delivery penalties and lost customer acquisition costs that had been accruing silently in the background. Elias told him that they weren't playing a game. They were running an engine, and the engine was currently on fire. He said, "You can report the record revenue today, but by next month you'll be reporting the record losses from the lawsuits and the churn. Momentum without control is just a crash waiting to happen." And Clara watched the room dissolve into an argument between the visionaries and the realist. She saw the fear in her executive's eyes, the fear of having to tell the board that the miracle quarter was a fluke. But she also saw the calm in Elias. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to prove he was smarter than them. He was just presenting the physics of the situation. He told them that they had to stop the new marketing campaign immediately and divert the entire budget to expanding the logistics infrastructure. "We need more hubs, not more ads," he stated firmly. This was the moment of the emotional sack, the choice between the ego of the CEO and the survival of the company. Clara realized that if she followed Elias, she would have to admit to the board that she had overextended the company. If she didn't, she would be presiding over a catastrophe. The tension in the room was a physical thing. Elias stood by his whiteboard, the red ink looking like blood on a map. He looked at Clara and said, "The view from the top is only as good as the foundation you're standing on. Right now, your foundation is made of paper. If you don't reinforce it today, you won't have a rooftop to stand on by Christmas." One of the young VPs tried to interject, but Clara silenced him with a sharp look. She turned to Elias and asked him exactly how much time they had. He told her they had 10 days before the system hit a total deadlock, a cascading failure, where every delayed order would trigger 3 more. 10 days to undo months of reckless expansion. It was a choice that would define her career and Elias's life. Clara felt the weight of her responsibility crashing down on her, the glamorous CEO persona finally cracking to reveal the leader beneath. In a move that shocked the entire room, Clara stood up and ordered the marketing team to pull the Global Growth campaign. She told Marcus to reallocate 40% of the quarterly profit into the operations budget under Elias's direct supervision. The room erupted in protests, with Marcus threatening to take it to the board. But Clara didn't budge. She looked at Elias and said, "I took your advice as a joke last night. I'm taking it as a command this morning. Get to work, Elias, and someone get this man a real cup of coffee." Elias simply nodded, packed his manila folder, and walked out of the room to start his shift. He didn't stay for the debate or the politics. He went back to the weeds where he belonged, leaving the executives to scramble in the wake of the truth. The following weeks were a blur of high-intensity labor. Elias lived in the distribution centers, sleeping on a cot in his office for 3 days at a time. He worked with the drivers, the warehouse staff, and the data analysts to reroute the entire flow of the company's products. He was the root doctor, digging into the soil of the organization to fix what was broken. He visited the docks at midnight to personally oversee the arrival of new sorting equipment. Clara joined him for several of these late-night sessions, swapping her designer heels for sneakers and her champagne for bitter coffee from a vending machine. She saw the world that Elias navigated every day, a world of mechanical failures, human exhaustion, and razor-thin margins. She learned that strategy was a luxury that only existed because of the execution that Elias provided. During a rare break at a loading dock at 3 a.m., the air thick with the smell of diesel and exhaustion, Elias told Clara a story about his garden. He told her how Maya loved to help him plant oak trees. He explained that most people focus on how tall the tree grows, but he focuses on how deep the roots go. He told her that if you don't check the roots every week, the tree will look beautiful right until the moment a heavy wind knocks it over. He said, "Our company was a beautiful tree with no roots. I'm just trying to make sure it doesn't fall on the people who work here, because when a tree falls, it's the smaller plants underneath that get crushed first." Clara listened in silence, realizing that Elias's philosophy of life was the very thing her leadership had been missing. She saw the integrity in his every action, the way he knew the names of the forklift drivers and asked about their families. The mini-climax occurred when the board of directors caught wind of the budget reallocation. They were furious, demanding a meeting to remove Clara for stalling growth. Clara didn't back down. She brought Elias into the board meeting. When the board members started shouting about the stock price, Elias didn't argue. He showed them a video of a major competitor whose system had just crashed that morning due to the exact same issues he had flagged: packages piling up in the rain, customers screaming at empty shelves. He showed them the news reports of customers fleeing that brand. He said, "We aren't stalling growth. We are building a fortress while our neighbors' houses are burning down. In 6 months, we won't just be the biggest, we'll be the only ones still standing." The board went silent. They realized that Clara hadn't lost her mind. She had found the only man who could see the future. The recovery was slow and painful, but it was real. The delivery delay rates began to drop from 20% to 3%. The employee turnover stabilized as Elias implemented better shifts and safety protocols. The hidden costs that Elias had identified started to evaporate, replaced by a lean, efficient operation that could actually handle the volume Clara had dreamed of. The relationship between the CEO and her operations lead transformed from a teasing rivalry to a deep, mutual respect. Clara stopped looking for the big win and started looking for the sustainable win. She realized that she had been a view leader, but Elias was a ground leader. Together, they were becoming something much more powerful. A leadership team that knew both where they were going and what they were standing on. In a private conversation in his small office, surrounded by stacks of logistical maps, Clara admitted that her tease on the rooftop had been a defense mechanism. She told Elias that she had felt the pressure to always appear superior, to always be the one looking down, because she was terrified that if she stopped moving, she would be found out as a fraud. Elias smiled, a rare, genuine expression, and told her that the only reason to look down on someone is to help them up. He didn't say it to be profound. He said it because that was how he lived. Clara laughed, not the sharp, patronizing laugh of the rooftop, but a warm, sincere one. She realized that the boring operations guy had more wisdom in his silence than she had in all her speeches. They were planting the roots of a new kind of company culture, one where the foundation was just as celebrated as the skyscraper. As the next quarterly gala approached, the company was in a completely different state. They hadn't broken a new revenue record, but they had broken a record for customer satisfaction and operational efficiency. The stock price was stable, and the board was finally satisfied. Clara called Elias into her office on a Friday afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across her desk. She offered him the position of Executive Vice President of Operations, with a seat on the board and a salary that would change his family's life forever. It was the ultimate validation of his 10 years of quiet service. Elias looked at the offer, then he looked at the clock. It was 4:30 p.m. He had a science project to help Maya with. He told Clara that he was honored, but he had a condition. He wouldn't accept the role if it meant he had to spend 60 hours a week in a suit. He told her that he was a single dad first, and an executive second. He said, "I can build your foundation, Clara, but I won't let my own home crumble while I'm doing it. A man who isn't there for his own daughter has no business leading thousands of other people's families." He expected her to be frustrated, to tell him that he had to choose the company to get to the top. Instead, Clara smiled. She told him that they would build the role around his reality. She said the company needed more leaders who understood the value of a 5 p.m. departure. She realized that Elias's balance was part of his strength, not a weakness. The final scene took place on the same rooftop, exactly 1 year after the first gala. The city below was still a sea of lights, but this time, the vibe on the rooftop was different. There were fewer egos and more conversations about sustainability and long-term health. Elias was there, again with his glass of water, standing by the glass railing. He looked at the traffic and saw that the flow was steady. The dark patches were filled with the efficient movement of his new logistics grid. Clara approached him, wearing a much simpler outfit than the year before. She leaned against the railing next to him and asked, with a soft, genuine smile, "Enjoying the view now, Elias?" Elias didn't turn away this time. He looked at the city, then he looked at Clara, and then he looked at his phone, which showed a picture Maya had sent of her finished science project. It was a model of a bridge with deep, reinforced pillars. He smiled and said, "More now, because I know what's holding it up, and I know I'll be there to see it tomorrow." The two of them stood there in silence, not as superior and subordinate, but as partners who had survived the storm together. The executives nearby didn't laugh this time. They watched the two of them with a sense of quiet awe, realizing that they were witnessing the new heart of the company. Leadership, Elias had taught them, isn't about standing at the top of the tower and mocking the ground. It's about being the person who ensures the ground stays steady for everyone else. Clara had learned that the view is only beautiful if you aren't afraid of the truth. As the night deepened, the lights of the city seemed to shine a little brighter, reflecting a company that was no longer a house of cards, but a fortress of integrity. She had teased him about the view, and he had reminded her of the reality. And in that exchange, they had both found a better way to lead. The final line of the story echoed in the minds of everyone who had heard the exchange. She teased him about the view. He reminded her what was holding it up. Leadership isn't standing at the top. It's knowing what keeps the ground steady. Elias Thorne, the single dad who once stood in the corner with a glass of water, was now the anchor of a billion-dollar legacy. He drove home that night, not as a corporate titan, but as a father who had kept his promise to be home for dinner. And in the quiet of his house, he knew that was the best view of all. CTA for High TL Stories. Channel. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the true meaning of leadership and integrity. This story is a testament to the power of the quiet professionals who hold our world together, often without a single word of thanks. If Elias's journey inspired you to value the roots over the leaves in your own life, please hit that like button and subscribe to High TL Stories. We believe that every single person has a story worth telling, especially those who work in the silence of the background. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next tale of justice, resilience, and hidden strength. Have you ever been the Elias in your office, holding everything up while others took the credit? We want to hear from you in the comments. Your story could be our next inspiration. See you in the next one.